Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I am on this Zoom call from London, where it's been snowing over the last couple of days, so it's quite cold out, near freezing, and it's been a delight for this California boy to be in the snow at this very special time of the year. This is December, so we're just finishing the Great Books courses over 3 trimesters for the year 2017. We are on our second and final lecture by Dr. Karen Castle on the oldest book we know attached to a specific author, Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon the Great, who established the first empire in Mesopotamia in the 23rd century BC. And I just wanted to point out one note before turning it over to Karen, just to remind ourselves that it was around this time that writing was invented. Writing was invented not so long before Enheduanna applied the cuneiform writing to a literary purpose. And that's very important to note. East or West, the first writing that's recorded that human beings utilized was not to write books. It was to keep track of products in the temple, trade contracts, arithmetical calculations. It was only secondarily by the emerging leisure class, of which Enheduanna was one, that people started to think that you could use cuneiform hieroglyphics for a literary purpose. So just imagine the invention of writing, the scribes in the temples and the marketplaces writing down, 13 bushels of corn for 48 bushels of wheat and an axe for a shoe. And then all of a sudden, this daughter of this king could have been the first person in history that thought, why don't I write a book? Why don't I write a book? And she wrote that book to Inanna, the great primordial mother goddess of Mesopotamia. And that's the great masterwork that we want to consider today. And we're very honored that Karen is joining us. She was a PhD student at the Wisdom School and wrote her dissertation on Inanna and in part on Inanna's relationship with the great Gilgamesh. So Karen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you for everyone who can be on the call today, but also for those who are listening on the recording. And it's, for me, just a delight to give this presentation on Enheduanna. As I had said in the last part of this course, that I had written 2 books on Inanna, and I wanted to give a background of Inanna so that people could understand not only the history, but the depiction of Inanna as a great and all-powerful goddess, and to the Sumerian people and their culture, really lifted her up. Her title is Queen. Her last title was given to her as Queen of Heaven and Earth, but she's also known as Goddess of Love and War, Goddess of Fertility. And what I pointed out in the last session was that particular things that she's noted for, and particularly the enact of the sacred marriage ritual with King Dumuzi and her journey to the underworld. So we get this development of a woman's life through Inanna's story. And it could be just through life in general. It doesn't necessarily need to be related to woman or feminine aspects, because the symbolic characteristic is so extensive in relating to different parts of how we grow in our life. So now we have a story of Enheduanna, which is a woman who, as Jim had stated, the first known author in history. And Enheduanna is interesting for me because I've focused so much on Inanna's story and her myth and background, and I also worked with the Epic of Gilgamesh, so all of this extensively with the Sumerian culture. Now diving into Enheduanna so that I can display a really personal aspect of who she was, because she's a very public figure. She's, as Jim had stated, born of King Sargon as her father, and then also her mother is thought to be a Sumerian priestess. And her father, you can imagine growing up in a palace, in a lavish environment, filled with prosperity and creative, all the creative aspects that you can think of were, she was allowed to experience with. And that she continuously witnessed her father's victory over foreign lands. So King Sargon was the first king in history known to be successful in creating an empire. And he conjoined the northern and southern city-states in Mesopotamia, which means that he brought together successfully the culture, the Akkadian culture and the Sumerian culture. And you have to understand that the Sumerians had been 500 years in their own independence and sovereignty. So it was quite an achievement for King Sargon. So Enheduanna is raised in this environment and continuously given whatever she had wanted, whatever she had wished for. So she's into womanhood, she's growing, and her father, King Sargon, appointed her to be the high priestess in the Temple of which is in southern Mesopotamia, and was the largest temple in that area. So it was quite a prominent position for her to carry, and in that manner, she had to be removed from her homeland, which is more in the northern part of Mesopotamia, the Akkadian area, into the Sumerian southern area in the city of And the temple of was basically the shrine for the moon god Nana, their tutelary deity, and the moon goddess Ningel. So Enheduanna's responsibility was to oversee all of the temple maintenance, all of the record keeping, as Jim had stated, you know, the writing initiated out of being able to record all of the transactions that went on, particularly around the temple. It became their political and religious together, their what the Sumerians were known for, because they continuously integrated their religious and political beliefs. So we see Enheduanna now in this role as a very prominent public figure. And we can compare her not necessarily from the same populace that we have today, but from the scale in that time, in ancient times, as the Pope, because she ruled over all of the religious sect of King Sargon's empire. And she then benefited from this position to go on to write 42 temple hymns, and all of these recorded on clay tablets. And further into history, into the future, these 42 temple hymns went on to make a huge influence in the people's belief for 500 years beyond her political position and her reign. So it's quite extensive. And what she's most noted for as being the high priestess, but also the poet of these temple hymns. And now, even today, we're speaking of her as the first known author in history. So what I want to do now is move into the some background, or I mean some summary on the temple hymns, and particularly point out the exaltation of Inanna, and do a little short recitation in a particular piece of that hymn. But what I want to do first is point out something that is important in the Sumerian culture that was very significant, was their connection with nature and divinity. A daily ritual, they connected their agricultural aspects, and through the offerings to the temple and to the gods and goddesses. So they offered bulls and sheep and baskets of dates and pomegranates. And this was part of their everyday actions. And so it's important to note that they were extremely integrated with their gratitude and praise to their gods and goddesses, and then particularly with Inanna. And we can see this especially through Enheduanna's writing, because she really goes into detail and there's so much information, so much explicit detail in her language and her writing, including the agricultural aspects, but far beyond that into consciousness, into human consciousness. We get so much from what she expresses through her voice in writing these hymns, that we become familiar with her personally. So she no longer stands out as this public figure. She's writing in her first person, and we begin to have this intimate relationship with her that is describing her intimate relationship with Inanna. And again, noting that the importance to the Sumerians, to the Akkadian Sumerian, because at this point it was King Sargon's empire in the 23rd, 24th century, and that this was a part of their everyday life, that they had this relationship with the Mother Earth, with nature, and with the deities. So I'm pointing that out particularly because out of the 42 temple hymns, there's 3 hymns that stood out in Enheduanna's writing. One is noted as Inanna and Mount Ebi, and this is we get a glimpse, a very small glimpse of when the separation begins to happen with nature and the divine. So in Inanna and Mount Ebi, I'll just read from my notes here that I wrote. We see this aspect of Inanna as her power reigning over the dark and light aspects, the cycles, the ebb and flow of nature is challenged by Mount Ebi. And this threatens then not only Inanna's power, but also it threatens the people of Sumeria, because they now are challenged with, and in the poem, it really could even be something that's looked at natural disasters, because it talks about fires overpowering the mountain and many different descriptions of destruction in the poem. And we can see here in this particular poem or hymn that now Enheduanna's relationship to Inanna, to her personal goddess, is strengthened. She's becoming closer and closer. She understands her more and more, and she is really expressing the importance of Inanna having this power over nature and the paradoxical aspects that are important, the ebb and flow and the cycle of life and change. Now, in the second hymn, Lady of Largest Heart, we get this really important piece of Enheduanna uplifting Inanna with ceaseless praise. She becomes the supreme goddess of all gods and goddesses. In her perspective, this is from her voice. It's a first person writing. So she is really getting explicit with the detail and at the same time intimate. So through her expression, we now can channel through Enheduanna and have also this sense of intimacy with the goddess Inanna and all that she encompasses, from the dark, the light, the whole paradoxical possibilities that are not only in our everyday material life, but also in the psyche, in our human consciousness. So it's very, very powerful, the poem Lady of Largest Heart, and particularly Betty Meador wrote a book on Enheduanna's, this particular hymn, titling the book Lady of Largest Heart. And what I found is that she really points out the ability of Inanna to contain the opposing forces and giving her that sense, that almighty sense. And she's speaking, as I had said already, as a channel. So she's like a vessel of truth for Inanna, expressing not only the love, but this depth of wholeness and again, this intimate connection she has to Inanna, which then provides us this sense of understanding of what's really at the heart of the matter, which is this expression of not only pain, but the joy that exists in the paradoxical forces of nature and in our human consciousness. So that's, you know, the Exultation of Inanna is one of the oldest books that has been complete in its entirety, whereas the other hymns have some missing pieces of the tablet, and that way sometimes have been filled in by different people that have translated. But the Exultation has been the most complete, which is why it's been the most popular, and why we are working with this one particularly today. But I just wanted to give you all of that background so that you have this other understanding and the extensity of Enheduanna's writing. So now moving into the Exultation, we get another deeper level of Enheduanna. We understand her more than ever personally. So she's this prominent public figure, right? But then we can now understand her and connect with her and relate to her from this personal level, which is important, and why perhaps we are discussing this and relating to her, and why she's been a continuum of interest for us as we grow as human beings, to understand that not much has changed in over 4,000 years as far as our human consciousness and psyche, aspects of our psyche. So when we work with the Exultation of Inanna and begin to read this poem and hymn, we realize that what Enheduanna experienced was something of a great challenge. She was thrown out of her temple, her position as high priestess, and exiled. She gives these specific detail, and her language, like I said, is very extensive in explaining what happens to her when she's thrown out of her temple. She's thrown into the forest, into the wild nature. And as I said in the beginning, this is different for her completely. This is something she's never experienced before, because she's always had everything that she's needed. She's always been protected. She grew up in the palace, and again, a political figure. But now she's completely vulnerable, and she's a victim. So she is in full expression of how she feels in the Exultation of Inanna. And I went into some of the poem and decided to just take out a small section to recite, because we can all read it, and maybe it'd be a good thing to read after the session to get, again, that deeper sense of where all this is coming from, because it is so, it's really far out there with all of the language that she uses, and it's expressing Inanna as this furious goddess that is destroyer. We get a real understanding of Inanna as creator and destroyer, and then helps us to get the magnification of what Enheduanna experienced in her life and her perspective of Inanna. So with this deep anguish, she pleads to Inanna and to the moon god, Nanna, to help her to regain her status, to return her to her temple, and to reestablish her sovereignty. So it's very, very embellishing. And I noted that I'm reading from the particular citation of the link that is on the website, but then I'm adding some of the description and the translation from Betty Meador in the book Inanna, Lady of Largest Heart. Enheduanna cries, "Must I die because of my holy songs?" Then she says to Nanna, "My Nanna, the moon god, you have paid no heed to me. I have been destroyed and shut out to remain vulnerable in renegade territory. He, the traitor king," we're not sure exactly who this male figure is, "stood there in triumph and drove me out of the temple. He made me fly like a swallow from the window. I have exhausted my life strength. He made me walk through the thorn bushes of the mountains. He stripped me of the rightful crown of the high priestess. He gave me a knife and dagger, saying to me, 'These are appropriate ornaments for you.'" To Inanna, Enheduanna says, "Be it known that you are lofty as the heavens. Be it known that you are broad as the earth. Be it known that you destroy the rebel lands. Be it known that you are unshakable and unyielding. Be it known that you always stand triumphant. My lady, I have heaped the coals in the censer and prepared the purification rites. Might your heart not be appeased towards me? I gave birth to this exaltation for you, my queen. Child of yours, I am captive. Bride of yours, I am captive. It is for my sake your anger fumes. The powerful lady, respected in the gathering of rulers, has accepted her offerings. Inanna's holy heart has been assuaged. And then we get an image of Enheduanna standing in her royal robes, and she is looked upon by the people and by the moon god Nanna and Ningel and Inanna with favor. And she closes the poem with praise to Inanna, the destroyer of foreign lands. So that's just a small part of that hymn, that poem, and it's quite extensive. And again, I invite you to reread it if you haven't already, because it's quite embellishing in the language and the description she uses. At that time, ancient times, and to think of what she experienced, and then to really have this connection that 4,500 years ago, somebody wrote something that we can even relate to today, because it relates to our human suffering. It's about human suffering and her experience of that. She gives us this range of complex possibilities in our unconscious. And it's something particular about this poem that stands out from all writing in ancient times, because it's in that first person and it's really speaking from her self-expression and her emotions. She's sharing her hopes, her fears, her faith, all of these things that we can relate to. And as her as a victim. So I think it's fair to say that in all of the world today, that we have this understanding of human suffering, that everybody has at one point in time experienced this. And then getting this depiction from Enheduanna of what she experienced thousands of years ago brings us this vast aspect of the ideology of wholeness. So it's, like I said, not much has changed in over 4,000 years of our human nature and how we are in our psyche, what exists there in the unconscious. And it's interesting to be witness to Enheduanna's experience through her writing. That also is very unique. And that what we understand from those of you who are familiar with Dr. Jung's individuated consciousness is we can get a glimpse of this with Enheduanna's writing. So even thousands of years ago, we understand what this can be like, someone who's able to have her own voice. But in this poem, she's being challenged and she's thrown out and exiled. So everything that she's ever known has been taken away from her, and yet she has not been stripped of her voice. So this also is something that stands out for me and is really, really powerful. And I just want to tie that in to our everyday, and I'm going to mention that in just a minute, but also I want to point out that what we see also with Enheduanna in the writing is that she's pleading to reestablish harmony. She wants the balance and the natural order. She's begging for Inanna and for Nanna, the moon god, who had brought this all along her whole life, not only for her, but the people in Mesopotamia, to have this paradisiacal bliss. And from the Sumerian culture, I mean, that was what they thrived on, why they grew so quickly in popularity and their agricultural aspects and farming, was because they existed in this paradisiacal bliss. So having all of that stripped, and her concern for the loss of the rituals and the ceremony was really, really important to Enheduanna as well. And she's asking for a return to balance and the natural order and a return to harmony. So here and again, I can see that we all can relate to that, because we all want to have this return of the natural order, of harmony. And what we're experiencing is lots of turmoil in our everyday life. So we can just use a couple examples of tyranny in the government, so similar to this poem, and the political power, the aspect of, dealing with political power on a regular basis in countries worldwide, and the being in the face of terrorism in the last few years has been so just vulnerable for so many people, and then to be in the face of it and people pleading for safety, for protection. And then also in the wake of natural disasters, we can see this, especially just being in the US. Some of you may be aware of the fact that I've traveled throughout the world over the last couple of years, but just in the last few months, I've been residing again back in the United States, and the amount of natural disasters that we've experienced and the suffering that people have dealt with has just been, innumerable. It's beyond what we can even imagine. So we can relate through our human suffering with others. But what I also want to point out is that for me particularly, in reflecting on this temple hymn, is that then asking myself, what is my relationship with nature and the Mother Earth and the natural order, and striving to have balance and harmony through all of that? So what is my relationship that I have, and how do I foster or give to that every day? And then based on the practice and the Sumerian culture of their rituals. And then also with the psyche, the human psyche, and looking at how do I awaken to the paradoxical aspects of the psyche, and how am I in my everyday life playing a role of responsibility, or having leadership to be a good example for others in this aspect. So then lastly, I just want to say that what we can look at to compare, from 4,000 years ago into our everyday, is that people are standing up and voicing their beliefs and their rights, and standing up for their rights. We see in the recent, from a few years back, the uprising in Egypt, that people really stood up and tried to overrule the government. And then in many of the Eastern European countries in the last couple of years, the revolutionary protests, and most recently with women in the United States standing up and expressing their experiences of sexual assault, and just asking for equality. So all of this that we have in our modern era, we can say is relatable from ancient times. And particularly now, people joining together in self-expression to voice their needs in hope of releasing their suffering. So as I said, this is a common trait that we experience, a common thing that happens in our everyday life. And then it's important to know how we relate and that we can relate to others worldwide through our suffering. So that's what I have for you, and I'd like to open up to comments and spend some time with sharing people and understanding what other people think from this.
Thank you, Karen. That was splendid.
Thank you.
That was splendid. You know, the whole issue of how contemporary these ancient great works are is such an important point to bear in mind. They were as intelligent, as emotionally aware, as psychologically complex as we are today. Quite extraordinary. So thank you for a very deep and rich presentation. So why don't we dive right in, and Mark, we'll start with you, and then Will, and then Georgie, and then we'll open it up to the students.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, especially Karen. That was, I must say, I was just fascinated by this material. It's because it's so ancient, and you know, I'm reminded, Jim, of your metaphor of drawing the bow back as far as we can, and in order to understand ourselves more fully. And you can't draw the bow much further back, at least by any kind of written record. So it was just, and I particularly admired, Karen, your focus on the symbolic elements in consciousness, and the way, because that gives us a way to relate to this material, which is, objectively speaking, about as foreign as anything can be from our own everyday lives. So it was a beautiful presentation. I have really two questions I'd like to throw back at you, Karen, and you've touched on both of them, but I want to invite you to run with either of them a bit more if you're so inclined, and for that reason I'll ask them both, and then you can choose how you want to respond. Reading this material from the site that you posted for us on the internet, I saw all of what you're talking about, and including perhaps what stands behind the phrase, the lady of the largest heart, given by the author you mentioned. But I have to say that what stood out for me very strongly was the violence and tribalism that's expressed in all of this. It's not a destroyer that's simply an impersonal destroyer indicating the impermanence of all things, like a Shiva. It's, Inanna is exalted for her malevolent anger, is one phrase that comes in there, her destruction of foreign lands. She's depicted as crushing heads and devouring corpses. And I'm just wondering how you process all of that in that psychological perspective that you've given us that's so valuable in our understanding of this work. And the second question is this. I have in mind your beautiful account of how you came by this material initially, and this name of close to Inanna that you heard in a session of holotropic breathwork, when you really hadn't been conscious of that of that name at all before, as far as you knew. And so this obviously hits you on an extremely personal level, and that's come through beautifully in your expression of it. But I'm really want to push you a bit on that and ask, why do you think that is? What about this is most significant to you personally, and why does it have such a live charge for you? We can see the scholarly interest certainly, but I'm wondering what it means to Karen.
Okay.
So those are my questions.
Thank you. Those are good questions. And I have to be honest that in reading the specific detail and description of Enheduanna's Inanna, of the furious goddess that is just not only destroyer, but you know, just terrifying, right? To think of what she's capable of. And I've always known that about her, because I had early on had read the Exultation and the Inanna and Mount Abbey and the Lady of Largest Heart. But I didn't really, with my scholarly work in Inanna, move in that direction. I moved more in the direction of her myth as a woman's growth and development, and tied that in with the chakra energy and Dr. Jung's individuation.
Yeah.
Because that was more relatable to me at the time. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, and reading it over and over and over again, and becoming a little bit more not as surprised, or not as just unbelievable language that she uses for Inanna, becoming more and more familiar, more comfortable, knowing that this is what's going to, how she expresses her. And I continue to liken her to the goddess Kali in that way, as the creator and destroyer, like I pointed out, because this is what, as human beings, we are all capable of. And again, we can see this in the face of terrorism and in the tyranny of government and all of the, you know, the, what is the word I want to use? Where people have been violated in their own countries. And, you know, we know of this. I mean, some of this maybe even still existing today, of the abuse and the assault and what's going on in the world. And it's part of our human psyche. So when we become aware of it, then, and even acknowledge this is what we're capable of, it changes how we deal with it, right? So it is very, very interesting. I have sort of grappled with it, as I am now, with the extensity and the intensity, but also the intimacy that Enheduanna expresses Inanna. This is her personal goddess. And I think that we can all stand in that position with Enheduanna and say, God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you shooed me out? Why have you taken away what is so important to me, these many different things, so we all can feel that at some point in time in life. And what might we say when we are feeling that to our personal spiritual gods or deities or whatever is that we consider to be the divine? So what is our own anguish and anger expressing when we come to this time? What are the possibilities of that? I don't know, it's different for everybody, but what we're seeing in the exaltation are the possibilities of what exists in our human psyche, because it's written by a human being. And then personally, what does it mean to have this relationship with Inanna is just a really, really great question. And I've thought about it a lot, and I think that it's transformed for me over the 10 or so years, 10 plus years that I've had the awareness of Inanna and delved further into understanding her story and who she was or is as a deity, a goddess. So it's changed for me. And at one point it was bringing out some empowerment in my own development, being able to speak my truth, have a voice, which I would say 15 years ago, I didn't. So being able to come to where I'm at today, I have to give some credit to Inanna and understanding the levels of what we're capable of. And then also, you know, I think it's fair to say that living in America is advantageous for women to be able to speak their voice, because we can we feel more able to do that, more safety, more protection, which maybe in I don't know, past lives, if you have that sort of belief or not. I'm still grappling with that one, but that maybe in my past lives that wasn't always the case, and perhaps maybe I went through some deep struggle, challenge, and suffering of my own in expressing my belief for Inanna. So all of it is coming out in the fashion as it should, and I still am getting more benefits continuously with my relationship to Inanna. So thank you for asking that question.
Beautiful answers. Thank you.
Before we move to Georgie, I just wanted to take note of something in the chat from Myra Jackson. Karen, if you can check your chat, I think it'd be worth, given what you just answered for Mark, to comment, you know, as she's wondering if in these writings we get a hint of what we see today as the linkage between ecocide and the violence against women, men, and others by what we ascribe to the empire builders. So maybe you could give a comment on that. That's very insightful, Myra. You know, Enheduanna was writing as patriarchy was taking hold. And I'm at some level, I'm sure the violence with which patriarchy organized civilization in the urban centers of Mesopotamia had to have some at least contextual influence on what Enheduanna wrote. But Karen, what would be your comment on this?
Well, I'm not familiar with the term ecocide. Actually, this is the first time I've come across it, so it's very interesting. But I get that it's
The death of nature, what we're doing against the environment. You know, like genocide. This is where you killed a genus of people. Ecocide is the destruction of nature.
Okay, so based on the one particular hymn, Inanna and Mount Ebi, and as I mentioned, that what we get is a very early glimpse of the separation of the divine and nature that obviously had the trajectory that it has today, and that what maybe in thousands of years ago was something that we weren't able to keep, control of, or the evolution of the way things went was beyond human control, right? And the aspect of the king, the empire, believing that they didn't need the divine interrelationship to maintain order in the people and in the civilization and all of their environment. So, and this goes to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now I have to turn to this because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this was the inquiry of my dissertation, is why did Gilgamesh reject Inanna's advance for the sacred marriage ritual, which was the ritual for thousands of years of the people it was like the highest ceremony for people to bring together the divine with the human and the balance of opposites, all the opposing forces, male, female, light and dark, divine and human, and what we know today is the Hieroskamos. So it's the sacred marriage. And Gilgamesh rejected that, was the seed also for man believing that they didn't need the divine to have what is, the favor of what all humans want, which is prosperity and to have everything that we want and to be free of suffering. And what ensued then was powering the feminine energies and the feminine aspects, and then in turn the females and the weak, and so on. So I hope that helps give some more understanding or answer the question. I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but I think that it goes, it stems from here, but then we get more of a bigger picture of that with the Epic of Gilgamesh and how that unfolded in the trajectory of the patriarchal order.
Yeah, just before turning to Georgie, I just think that the comment, Mark, that you made is so important, that from the earliest literature we see and know, violence permeated society and nature. And Enheduanna grappled with it, Inanna grappled with it, Gilgamesh grappled with it, and it has been endemic in the history of our kind from the very beginning of civilization. So it's just worth, and Myra, I just copied Myra's chat to the whole group. I think, Myra, you're pointing to something very deep in the psyche and in humanity's relationship with the gods and goddesses, as well as each other and civilization and nature itself. So thank you for that. Georgie.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Karen, for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to keep it short because we would like to leave some time to Will Tegel and Myra and the rest of our listeners. There is one aspect I would like to broach with you, which is the great power of storytelling. Since time immemorial, the elders were teaching the offsprings about their history, about the meaning of life, about values and ethics and aesthetics and so forth. And we can bring up lots of examples from the Finnish Kalevala to the Bhagavad Gita, the Yellow Emperor from China, or Gilgamesh, or the Greek mythologies elsewhere. But I would like to point out what you referred to twice, and I'm not sure if I understood you. You said that in 4,000 years, humankind hasn't changed a lot. Did you mean that humankind's consciousness or humankind as a whole? But anyhow, my question would be that if humankind, in your view, hasn't changed a lot, or its consciousness in the last 4,500 years, then what is the purpose of storytelling as a teaching tool? Does it have any use at all if humankind's consciousness hasn't changed? And if it is only for entertainment purposes or recording history, then what would it take to change human consciousness in order to co-create a much more peaceful and just world? Light questions.
Of course. Yeah, light questions keep us entertained. Well, great. Yes. So what I meant is that not much has changed in the consciousness of humans because of what exists in our psyche. So we can see 4,000 years ago, all of the aspects of creation, maybe not so much in the exaltation, but in the hymns are there of Inanna's ability to create, or even the deities, the gods and goddesses, and the aspects of agriculture and growth, and how they grew in their culture. And so for that reason, I mean, the psyche, the human psyche, it can evolve and change, but it takes us to be responsible human beings and perhaps individuated to experience that. And I think that was one of the things that Jung was striving for, is to point out how.
Oops. Where is Karen? Where is she?
We lost Karen.
Right. Well, while she's coming back, I really would like to just go back to my original point, that really, what does storytelling as a teaching tool play part in the evolution of human consciousness? Because I believe that every single story has a deep meaning and a meaningful message to change our consciousness, to evolve, to learn from the history of our elders and the folk tales, what has been told throughout centuries. So I think that is a very important element here, and would have loved to ask Karen that what is, in one sentence or maybe in two, the exact and very peculiar, a very important message of Inanna. But maybe we can leave this conversation for another time, because I know that time is is going on, a very fluid entity as time it is, and would like to pass the talking stick to Will so that we could have sufficient time for our listeners. Thank you very much, Karen.
And let me just finish commenting on that, if you don't mind. Apologize for losing the signal there. So one thing that I wanted to point out about the storytelling is the aspect of relatability. And this is what I wanted to really kind of emphasize in the session today, in the discussion of Enheduanna, because what we do have in storytelling is the human relatability factor. And it's huge, I think, for us to understand that we can relate to each other in many facets, but particularly through human suffering.
So Karen, what does, in 2 sentences, and this is the last thing, what does Inanna teach us? What is the story? What is the undercurrent of the story itself? Why is it so different to any other stories?
Yeah, particularly there's the story of Inanna, but then there's this poem, Temple Hymns, that were written by Enheduanna. And this particular, the Exultation, is pointing out that we have in our everyday this element of human suffering. And we can relate to each other through this. And then it's pointing out the expression of our human psyche.
Okay, thank you. Will, over to you.
Will, you have a comment? And then I know Farnak's got her hand up, so we'll go Will and then Farnak.
Well, thank you so much for that, Karen. Just a couple of contextual comments, and that is that the underlying theme, as I see it from what you read, was the return to balance with the natural order. And I think it's I see Enheduanna as a bridge walker from one era to the next. And I wonder if you see any hints there for us today as we walk from one era to the next. She was really walking from, if you think about the domestication of wheat in Ur, where she lived, was actually 8,000 years before she wrote this poem. And so there were several civilizations that evolved before hers. So what kind of bridge, hints, do you think she has for us as we walk from one era to the next?
That's very good. Well, I would say that what, in referring to Enheduanna having this, pointing out about the return to balance, and again, because I've thought this through, is that are we ever in a state of balance? We have throughout history the ebb and flow, and it's known over and over and over again, the cycle of change. Mm-hmm. And then how we deal with it is important. How we view it. What is our perspective? Because everybody has a different perspective. So it's important to take that into consideration, that everybody's going to view grief, assault, loss of a loved one, all of these things very differently. Some will take it with gratitude and find some meaning in it in their life, but then others will take it badly. So for Enheduanna, as a bridge walker into this shift and transformative time in our human evolution, is that I think it's important for us to stand up for what we believe in and to speak our truth and to say how we feel and to have our own voice and to come together, to join together, because when we join together, then not only is it more powerful, but it is then humans are relating and we ease the suffering that exists in our everyday.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question, Will. You know, what we learn from the bridge walkers that have gone before, and what we learn from, you know, what I like about your answer, Karen, just to make a comment before Farinach, is, you know, the question, do we ever get to the other side of the river? You know, that's what we were grappling with in Wisdom and Civilization, the course back a couple months ago in Texas. You know, it is, we have bridge walkers, and does the culture ever make it to the other side? And how do we balance the contradictions that reside on both sides? And it's very, very complicated. And that's why these great works of these great books really lay out the complexities of the contradiction and the pathway. And you know, to Georgie's point about the power of story, and very profound question, Georgie, do stories have the capacity to change consciousness, or is human nature the same today as it was 10,000 years ago? Is change possible at a collective level, or is it completely individual? These are really deep, deep questions.
Just one comment before we go to
please.
You know, the cyclical nature of the story is very important, because we generally think that writing arose in response to the domestication of wheat, when we begin to store our food. That's the story that we've been given by archaeology and anthropology. The question I would raise, not to answer today, but the story I would raise is, what about those 7,000 or 8,000 years? Wheat was domesticated at Göbekli Tepe. It was 3,000 years before Çatalhöyük arose, and 7,000 or 8,000 years before writing arose. So far as we know. So I just raised those questions for future conversation.
Great questions. Thank you. Farinach.
Hi. Hello. I'm speaking from the airport in Bristol. I hope there won't be 1,000 announcements. I wanted to share my personal experience as I journey towards my first storytelling, myth-sharing event where women are signing up for. And I have to say, in my experience, is that Inanna demands embodiment. This is my conclusion of after having announced that I will do the storytelling and share with other women, you know, ancient myths. Suddenly I found myself in I hope it goes well. I'll give a pause until she's done. That suddenly I was forced to give up my house that I had just used and as for my Jungian therapy in the
Ooh, you're breaking up.
so I was and to give up my house, and then suddenly I was in court where they were trying to get my part of the property, and they are still doing this. And Sunday is my first Inanna storytelling. I found myself suddenly in court being accused of all sorts of stuff that's not true, and with lawyers, and I was standing there ironically thinking of the story I have to share. Is taken of her possessions, and then Enheduanna driven out of her temple, and inside I was crying and laughing. And I still am, because what I understand now, trying to understand in the chaos that's being thrown at me, is that the goddess demands embodiment. She demands a total and complete incarnation. And I think these hymns and stories are giving us that, which is what was brought up, is forcing me at least to come into a constant state of surrender. It's like, no, it's not about surrendering once or twice. It's being in a constant state of surrender. And I think that that is the
We may have lost Farnak. You've frozen, Farnak. Oh,
Too bad. It was great.
yeah, she was on a roll. Karen, do you want to comment? I think we got the gist.
Yes, right, based on suffering. Yes. So, not suffering, I'm sorry, surrender.
Yeah, you
Sorry?
were breaking up, but we got the gist.
Right, so.
yeah, so that is that this is what the goddess demands, is this being and keeping you on this edge of surrender and constant surrender. And a worship what I experienced when I decided to bring Inanna into my life, suddenly this wave came in, and it's like, wow, you are a power. And she demands embodiment. She's like, you're not going out there sharing my story if you've not embodied it the way I feel you should embody it. So that's my personal experience in the short ways that we connected last time. That's
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, these
Yeah,
stories.
thank you, Farnak. I think the element of surrender is a good one to point out in this particular hymn, and that at times this is obviously what we need to have that happen. But she stands strong, and she carries forth, and she's not willing to give up. So she's sharing her deep passion and need and desire to continue her role as high priestess, because she knows how important it is for the natural order and to carry balance. So, we can look at it. I do have a lot of favorism in surrender, because the holotropic breath work, we talk about that a lot, surrendering, but also standing your ground and being willing to carry the torch and continue forward for what you believe in.
Great. Well, thank you, Farnak. Good luck with it all. Good luck. Good luck. We've got a couple. I'd like Yulia Antonova. You just wrote a really incisive chat. Do you want to speak to that? And then I think we've got Dave McQuarrie.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Jim. So my comment was actually about Enheduanna and why did it come up? Because when I was preparing the final paper for this course, and I was actually, what like struck me is the importance of the author himself of the book. Like I started taking a great research, doing a research on each author. I didn't like the same it was with Prince of Machiavelli. I didn't like the prince. But when I found out who Machiavelli was and his life and the conditions of his life, I changed my mind about the prince himself. It was similar to the Siddhartha. Like, I liked that book, but when I found out about Hermann Hesse, I was shocked and I reread the book. And the same is here. I guess it is very important for us to understand who was Enheduanna. Like Inanna was an image, she was a goddess, but understanding what was the message of Enheduanna, why did she write that book? Like, what was the purpose? Like, was she just, maybe her goal was simply to write the hymn to the goddess and just to address the goddess. Or maybe her actual goal was to send a message into the future to other people, or to address her, the community she lived in. Like, it is very important to understand these points, because this will give us a better understanding of the, I guess, the society or the level of development of the society of that time. So that's it.
Karen?
Okay. That's a really good question and good insight on that, Yulia. I would say that she was, from what I see, she was in full emotional expression of what she was experiencing in her exile and being thrown out of her temple, that she is the high priestess and now in the wild, in nature, which is interesting because she's expressing that she doesn't feel safe at all. She feels violated and vulnerable. So whether or not she recognizes it is something that she did influence people for, we know, 500 years. The clay tablets and her hymns were spread throughout Mesopotamia and had a great influence in people's belief systems. But now, even today, we're having this discussion of this particular hymn. So did she know? I don't know. That's a good question. And then it can point to each one of us having that same influence when we are aligned and we're able to spread the message to others, what we're experiencing. And then in that way we relate. We're sharing and we relate. Thank you.
I would just comment just quickly, Yulia, thank you. There's no doubt that Enheduanna was a transcendental genius. She was not a mere mortal. If you think of the Bible, you think of the I Ching, you think of Bhagavad Gita, you think of any of the big religious texts known to humankind, they're all were written at least 1,000, 1,500 years after Enheduanna. And as I said, you know, she may have been the first human being to write a work of literature. And this is really important. You know, we attribute great genius to Einstein, for example. Will gave a great lecture on Einstein at the Wisdom and Civ course. and he came up with E equals MC squared that had never been kind of conceived of before. And now every high school kid in the world knows E equals MC squared, right? So it's Rupert Sheldrake's morphic theory, right? Morphic resonance. That first breakthrough of consciousness is the genius. And once that first breakthrough happens, it makes that, whatever the breakthrough was, possible for others to do it more easily with less intelligence. And it's worth noting, as Karen pointed out, not only did her writing endure over time, a lot longer than 500 years, but she was considered a demi-goddess. She rose to divine status in her own lifetime. And was...
similar to Mother Mary.
Pardon?
Similar to Mother Mary.
Yeah. So what we're dealing in Enheduanna was not an insignificant individual. We should just acknowledge the extraordinary achievement of this young woman in the court of the first empire known in history, and the achievement that she bequeathed to us around the generation of literature. Quite an achievement. Yeah, it's 5:27, and I don't know whether I think
comment on Will's comments.
Yeah, and I think then we'll bring it to a close. It looks like Dave had to leave, and so why don't you make a closing comment, Karen, and then we'll say goodbye.
Okay, thank you. So Will's comment about complete homeostasis not available so far as we know, and such is the need for a dynamic center brought about by our intimate connections within nature, including humans, or aspects of the dynamic intimacy. So thank you, Will, for pointing that out. And then that was one of the questions that I asked myself. And we can all ask the question, what is our relationship with our everyday interrelation in nature and Mother Earth? And what do we want to bring forth as a good model, as an example of that relationship? And how does that keep us connected, not only to the divine, but to our fellow human beings?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Karen. This has been brilliant. You've done Ubiquity proud as one of our doctoral alumni. The questions that have come up through you and Georgie and Mark and Will and Faranak and Myra and Yulia have been quite extraordinary. This has been a great grand finale to the year. And any comments will obviously be welcome on our Facebook page. This completes the trimester. So students will have some written assignments that we will take in over the next month or two. Next year, starting in January, we will start our new trimester. And I'll be I'll start the year as I have done since the beginning here. And I'm going to take up Plutarch, who was the great storyteller of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and tell a few of my favorite stories from Plutarch, who ever since I first discovered him about 40 years ago, has been one of my favorite authors. And that will get us going into 2018. But Karen, thank you. And thank you all for everything that you've contributed to a very successful year that we're just now concluding. Happy holidays, everyone. Stay safe, celebrate much to be grateful for. Much love. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Blessings.